Good afternoon, everyone. I'm tempted to say it's an awful long time ago to be worrying about my government, but then I saw John Stone and I thought it wasn't quite such a long time ago, so it was all right. Look, I'm pleased to be here, and it is a subject that whilst most of the last 20 years I've had no active involvement in public sector reform, it is a matter close to my heart. I think the first thing to say, and I am doing roughly what I was asked to do, which is contemplate sort of back to 25 years ago, but to some extent I'll try and be relevant to the present or compare the two. I think the first thing to say is that what you might call the great man theory of political reform and political leadership is probably gone. It's certainly much harder for that traditional theory, which you might, ignoring present company, you might say it's the Jeff Kennett model. That model, the model of someone who simply says, look, this is right and this is the situation into which we're placed and this is what we're going to do, and yes, I'll explain the benefits, but it's essentially a follow me, guys, you're all behind me and I'm out front leading. I think that view of leadership, and it's a view I had as a very young man when I became Premier at 39. I think it's harder today, very much harder, to have that great man leadership model to work effectively as a means of political reform. It's not that I don't occasionally hanker for someone to be like that, but I think being realistic, it is harder today. It's harder in the sense that at the end of the day you are balancing politics and policy. It does mean that in the context of very short election cycles, and especially at federal level, but even at state, with the change in the nature of society, of individuals as well as the vested interest groups, the change in the nature of the media, the destruction of the more thinking parts of the media by technological change, the prevalence of social media, which makes every vested interest group, and most reform does end up taking on some vested interest groups. I think all of that stuff, all of which you're familiar with, makes the great man theory of political reform pretty hard. I'm going to do these pretty much bang, 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 because in this group it's more useful to have a discussion than a speech. The second point I wanted to make is that, of course, creating the need for change, or an appreciation, a perception of need for change, that remains a constant. And you would think that, burning platforms, there are as many burning platforms around the world today as there were in the 90s, 80s and 70s, so I don't think there's any shortage of them. The difficulty is, I think, that, and you can look at the recent election campaign, the sort of sense of crisis. Both sides said, oh yeah, there's a crisis of this or that. You know, Kevin said there was a crisis of the economy, transition from mining to other things. And Tony said, the Prime Minister now, new Prime Minister said there was a public finance crisis and so on. The reality is that the nature of the political game is that the crises on both sides seem to decline a bit in perceived intensity over the course of the 5 weeks. And that's simply you expect politicians to behave rationally in pursuit of their political goals, and I think it is the case that people really not that keen on a sense of crisis, and it is true in Australia that because by some good luck and some good management we escaped the GFC better than most other countries, it plays to the Australian sense of we're bulletproof. What might be happening in other parts of the world is not as important or not as relevant to Australia as it is elsewhere. So, you've had the obvious burning platform situations. Jeff Kennett inherited one and I think played it very well, although even he only managed to last 2 elections. In my case, in the government that I led and that Gary was very involved in, there wasn't an obvious burning platform, at least not in the public perception. So there was an element of creating one, and the Commission of Audit, which I'm the father of, for better or worse, and there's now been, I think we're about to have the 8th Commission of Audit. Every time there's a centre-right government comes in, they have a Commission of Audit. And it is partly about creating a context, an independent context, which the politicians perceive makes it easier to implement reforms that may not be instinctively palatable. Truth is, if there were easy and politically palatable reforms available, they by and large would be done by both sides these days. I mean, that's simply the truth. There is a bit of a race for the middle in terms of the way politics is played in most Western democracies. I think using independent inquiries is a sensible way to go in terms of, and certainly worked for us in terms of creating an understanding of the relevance of debt. You know, back in '88, the states sort of hid behind the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth had a AAA credit rating, so it didn't really much matter how badly the states were run. They could sort of hide behind the Commonwealth. So I deliberately set out to ensure that each state had to have its own credit rating, because I knew that would be an effective discipline both on my government and indeed on governments ever since. I think you do have to make sure that the terms of reference for these inquiries are either sufficiently broad or sufficiently, at least don't rule out results that you might want to contemplate. I think the inquiry, the Tamblyn inquiry that Premier O'Farrell had on electricity, managed to mostly exclude the poles and wires. And not surprisingly, the judge, being a judge, produced a report that didn't say much about the poles and wires, even though the merits of the case, you'd have to say, are pretty obvious. My point is simply devices like commissions of audit and similar things are a valid way of dealing with it, and I think given the risk appetite or lack of risk appetite of most of the politicians of the day, left and right, having someone independent to go behind is an effective means of at least accelerating some reform. I think one of the really bad developments is this question of precise mandates, and it's become fashionable, again from the left and the right, to say we are going to do everything that we said we were going to do. What that means is that if you're the opposition leader, you've got precious few resources and precious little advice. You wander down the main street of Blacktown or wherever, sometime before the election, and the Blacktown Bugle asks you your views on whatever it is, and you say whatever comes into your head. It's the nature of the political process. You then consider yourself held to that point of view when you win government. And you absolutely reject the old Keynesian thing about, when circumstances change, I change my mind, don't you? Well, the truth is it's become fashionable. I think Mr Abbott has said something along these lines, and the various new state premiers have all said, well, we're going to do exactly and in detail what we said we were going to do. Reality is that is unnecessary, and in many ways is a counter to difficult political reform, because your natural political instinct is to rule anything out that might be remotely difficult. And again, it's human nature, but it certainly doesn't make for the best outcomes in terms of public policy. So I think that the notion of ruling things out, which clearly is what the new breed of political advisors tell you to do, just say no. New airport for Sydney? No airport ever. Sale of electricity, poles and wires? No, absolutely not. Should be where it is. And the status quo is usually the safest place to be in political terms. So I think this notion of ruling everything out and defining a mandate, I do think it's perfectly obvious that Mr Abbott has a mandate on the carbon tax. I think the problem is when you get to a mandate for 1,000 little things, it's just illogical to believe that that's meaningful, or indeed that anyone at all in the community voted on the precision of every little thing that's said in the thousands and millions of words. So I think the question of keeping mandates directional, and to some extent keeping, I said in the interview that Gary and I did earlier with the CIS, everyone knew in 1988, people of the media were saying, Greiner wants to run New South Wales Inc. He wants to run it more as a business. So there was a clear directional understanding, for better or for worse, of what I was on about. And I think that's highly appropriate. The notion that you're going to spell out and then live up to every detail from opposition is just not plausible in my view. But it does seem to be the direction in which modern politics is going. The argument is we are going to build trust with the community. Usually, by definition, we're the opposition. We come into government. The previous government has lost trust. I'm going to have trust, and so I can build that by honouring every letter of what I said, positive or negative, beforehand. I think that's been taken a bit far. I do think in terms of reform, we tend because the policy community starts from the reform itself rather than from the benefits and working back. I think it's really very important that you start and do a much better job of what is the point of this. I think we tend to think, defining a broad reform community, tend to think some of these things are self-evident. So we're on about the nature of the reform itself, the structural change, the change in the labour market. We think productivity is an obviously self-evidently useful and important thing for the national well-being. And it is, but I don't think you can assume that the marketplace understands that. I think the marketplace thinks of productivity and they think, oh, well, it sounds like I'm going to work harder and I'm going to be paid less. That sounds like a productivity improvement. Doesn't sound very compelling for the average punter. So my point is that you look at the NDIS, it's a good example. Nobody worried, they should have worried more about how to fund it and how to structure it and all of that. But they started with the end game, which is that it's unreasonable if your child dives into Bondi, and no matter whose fault it is, he's going to need multiple millions for the rest of the life. It's not unreasonable in a society like Australia, but your child would be well looked after. And that became, so by starting from the benefit, the end point, and then working back in a pretty poor manner really, but working backwards, I do think that's the better way, because we tend to do it broadly the other way. We tend to start from the detail or the nature of the reform rather than the point of the reform, the benefit of the reform. And in that context, and John Stone is a good Treasury Secretary, will shoot me about this, I worry about the view that hypothecation is a really terrible thing. I think it is perfectly obvious that if you're trying to bring in significant reform, you have and NDIS is a good example, the 3x3 road program 22 years ago, which we had here. If you start by saying, yeah, we're going to put 3 cents a litre on your petrol, in those days the states had excise, but every cent of the 3 cents is going to go to roads, people think it's wonderful. Nobody said boo when their taxes went up 1.5% or whatever it was for the NDIS. There was not a glimmer of opposition, not a glimmer. No one said anything. So I do think the public likes hypothecation. I naturally understand the general Treasury argument about, well, you should bring all the money in and then you should work out what the priorities are and send it out. I think the evidence is very clear that if you find reform difficult, as the current crop of politicians do, then hypothecation is, or you'd use a different word because that doesn't mean anything to the average person, is very, very compelling. I think that's true, for example, of GST reform. You've really got to start with what are you going to do rather than just making the case for, oh, you should tax consumption more and all the perfectly correct tax arguments. If you actually want to do it and it's politically difficult, I think people need to understand the end point and work back. I don't think it's a profound thought, but I think it's pretty important. I do think grand coalitions and counterintuitive coalitions are important and useful. I think about the original GST and indeed the current GST situation. I went to something where the welfare lobby, whatever it's called now, NCOS is it, was making the case in favour of looking at the exemptions to the GST and looking at the rate, or at least unfreezing the rate. And their objectives and their reasons may not have been precisely what I might have thought, but the obvious point, and again it is obvious, to the extent you can build coalitions that bridge the obvious, that aren't the normal business versus union, left versus right, it is perfectly apparent that your chances are better if there is a broad coalition. And I said to this particular young man from NCOS, look, your contribution's much more important than the person from the BCA and from all the obvious lobby groups who were arguing for tax reform. So I do think looking at coalition building and not assuming that one gravitates naturally to the left camp and the right camp or whatever the natural ones is I think an important part of selling. And my final point, which is a good segue to Gary making some remarks, I think the public service role has changed for the worse. The public service does not seem to me to have in its self-perception or in the perception of the ministers, governments of the day, a clear, almost entrepreneurial role in policy. My clear impression, as I haven't been much involved in 20 years, is that by and large, especially at state level, but I think increasingly at federal level, the job is to channel the Premier, channel the Prime Minister, channel the Treasurer, whoever it might be. And it's become almost a variation of the Chief of Staff in the private office, who's usually got too much power. And so you now have department heads who do what not just Gary, but many of the department heads in my government did. They knew that the government respected and wanted them to advance reform ideas. My sense is that that is no longer wanted. It is, we'll have the ideas, we've been the omniscient politicians, and you just don't you bother with your idea, just take what I say and work out how we do it. I think it is a hard enough task to get reform to happen without freezing out a large part of the community that has some real skills, hopefully, some real skills and some real interest in reform. So I think, in terms of building coalitions, it isn't just building coalitions of lobby groups, it's building the sources of information. I mean, they're obviously the think tanks, if you like. There are a variety of obvious sources of policy ideas, but to not make it clear that the public service has excuse me, has a role, quite an intrinsically important role in terms of the policy debate, rather than just its implementation, seems to me an error, and seems to me yet another hurdle that you're setting up for yourself in what is, if I can go back to where I started, and I'll finish on this note, it is obvious there's reform fatigue around the Western world. It is not a peculiarly Australian phenomenon. It is pretty much a global phenomenon, which tells you that there are sort of things happening in society, in politics, in the way people are educated, structure of institutions and so on. So it is hard work. So you really do need a full court press if you want to get anywhere. Thank you.